Good morning. Today we're going to get into the 22nd chapter of the Gospel according to Luke, and the action really intensifies in this chapter. Jesus is getting ready for the festival of unleavened bread, which is called the Passover. That's how the chapter begins. And this meal together with his disciples is what has developed into what we call the Lord's Supper or Holy Communion or the Eucharist, all referring to the same thing, and is rooted in this story of this last night Jesus has with his disciples. It is interesting here because Jesus blesses bread, breaks it, and gives it to his friends and says, "Take, eat, this is my body. Um, do this in remembrance of me." And then he does the same thing with the cup. He says, "This cup as poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." And it's interesting because I don't know about you, but a few years ago, a friend of mine whose wife is Jewish, and they invited us over for a Shabbat meal, the Sabbath meal on Friday night. It's very interesting because they were trying to be very traditional about it because we were there, and so there were prayers for bread, for the blessing of bread and the thanksgiving of bread, and for the cup, and so Jesus is very much being very Jewish in this meal. Now he's reframing it and taking it in a different direction. He's putting himself at the center. This is my body. This is my blood. This is the bread is my body, and the wine is my blood. And so he's making himself the center of that covenant. But this is all wrapped up in a Passover meal. So we have also that reference to the feast of Passover, which refers to the last plague, but in the Exodus story, before the Israelites were sent out of Egypt, were allowed to leave Egypt, and God made a covenant with them to be a nation, covenant with the people. And so this is a very, very Jewish story. And it's interesting because remember from the prologue, the author of Luke is writing to Theophilus, which is a Greek name, probably a patron of the community that Luke was a part of, or the author of Luke was part of. And that's a Greek name. So one could argue that his audience is primarily Greek. And there's some other things that he does with Jesus that we talked about in the birth narrative that really could show that Luke's primary audience is the Greek, Roman, Hellenistic world. But Jesus is very, 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 very Jewish in the gospel according to Luke. He was presented in the temple on the 8th day by Mary and Joseph, which was prescribed by law for the Jewish law for the firstborn of a family. A lot of major action happens in the temple, the center of Jewish religious and political thought even. So he's very, very Jewish, and he's reframing this meal, this holy meal, around him as the covenant. Do this in remembrance of me. This is my body, which is given for you. This is my blood, which is the covenant, the new covenant with you. Of course, our lovely, wonderful disciples don't get it. Immediately after this, Jesus has done all this teaching about reversals and the lowest being raised up and the high being brought down. And then we have this ultimate thing where Jesus is giving his own body up for them, his very life up for them, and memorializing it in this meal. And then immediately the disciples start arguing about which one of them is the greatest. In typical fashion. And Jesus, gets one last shot to bring home this point about servant leadership. It says, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Whether the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials. And I confer on you, just as my Father has conferred on me, a kingdom, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel." Now that last part, taken out of context, makes them sound like any other king. But remember, he just gave them instructions on how they are to lead, and they are to lead as servants. And so, again, this all through the book, we have seen this theme about the powerful being brought down and the lowly being lifted up. From the Magnificat that Mary sings before Jesus is even born, all the way through here to the Last Supper. The rest of the chapter has Jesus praying for the cup to pass him and him not have to go through this, but the angel gives him strength, and then Judas betrays him, and then they carry him away. Peter's denial of Jesus is in this chapter, and at the very end, Jesus is done testifying in front of the Jewish leadership, and then they are beginning in chapter 23, which we'll get into tomorrow. They'll take him to Pilate, and we'll move in to the crucifixion tomorrow. So, hope you'll stick with us. Look forward to talking to you again tomorrow. And as always, if you have any thoughts or comments or questions, I'm eager to hear them. You can post them on YouTube or on my blog, and we'd love to have some conversation around what your experience has been reading the book of Luke, but also what's going on in this chapter as well. I hope you have a gracious day. Bye-bye.